Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody. It is so incredible to be a part of this event. I see we have many people in the Zoom session with us and even more on the Facebook page. This is very exciting. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, to attend this unique event and to mark this incredible moment in history. This is an intentionally interfaith and intercultural event. It is an outgrowth of a series of events begun by Holy Blossom Temple and Imdadul Islamic Center called Moving from Hate to Hope. And you'll hear a little bit more about that later on in the program. But for right now, that's where this came from. This came from an event called Moving from Hate to Hope, Understanding Islamophobia and Anti-Semitism, where I sat down at a table with Ahmed Tamici, who at the time I did not know is a respected civic leader, an interfaith activist, and the immediate past president of the Intercultural Dialogue Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that aims to advance social cohesion in Canada through education, engagement, and empowerment. He is also a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and serves on a number of advisory boards, including the Muslim Advisory Board at Emmanuel College, the National Regional Ethnocultural Advisory Committee at Correctional Services Canada, the OPP Recruitment Council, the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, and the Toronto Interfaith Council. So it is my absolute pleasure to have met Ahmed at this event and to have worked together to bring this program together for you.
Thanks, Andrea, for this warm introduction. It is indeed my honor to work with you on bringing this program tonight. And it is my honor to present tonight's program with you. And now it is my turn to introduce you to the audience. Andy Lulka immigrated to Canada as a child from Mexico and has both Ashkenazi and Sephardic roots. She started publishing, writing, and speaking about education, the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism from intersectional perspectives in her teenage years. Andy holds a Master's of Education in Integrative Montessori Learning, has taught students aged from 2 to 14, written curriculum, and designed programs. Andy is now focused on teacher development and support and is a sought-after speaker and moderator for panels and online discussions on Montessori education, as well as anti-bias work. Thanks for the great work. And before I turn to Andrea again, let me give you a brief overview of the program and share some technical details. We will have a program that will focus on learning, remembering, and developing a roadmap in order to build resilient communities that can stand against the rising tide of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all other forms of xenophobia. As David Cameron mentioned yesterday at the Remembering Srebrenica program in UK, unless we remember, we will be doomed to fail again. We all have a collective responsibility to act in the face of intolerance, hate, and persecution. And it is important to keep in mind that all actions, even as small and insignificant it may be seen, every action counts. We will start today's program with an invocation by our religious leaders, and then continue with a video that will provide us an understanding about what happened in Srebrenica 25 years ago. After the video, we will have a discussion that will focus on why it is important to come together in interfaith and intercultural groups to remember and reconnect with the true meaning of never again. Then we will close the program with a few final remarks. Before we start, a couple of reminders. Since we are at full capacity, the event will be also broadcasted live on Facebook. You may also join the conversation by sharing your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom or in the comment section of the event's Facebook page. We will monitor your questions and direct them to our presenters during the discussion part. The event will be about an hour long, and we will be making the recording of the program available on our partners' social media sites next week. Now, let me turn to Andrea to start the program.
Thank you, Ahmed. We are here to remember and to honor the victims and survivors of the Srebrenica genocide. We are here to learn the lessons from the genocides that took place 25 years ago and 75 years ago in Europe. We are here to honor the legacy of our people and to keep vigil against hatred and intolerance in our communities. We are here to recommit to taking positive action to build stronger and more resilient communities together. And in accordance with this commitment, Ahmed will give the land acknowledgement now, bringing to the forefront of our minds the ongoing systemic oppression of Indigenous people, even if for a brief moment to further our reconciliation work.
And we acknowledge that the panelists on this call today are speaking from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Huron-Wendat Nation, the Haudenosaunee Nation, the St. Lawrence Iroquois Nation, the Mohawk Nation, and the Algonquin Nation. We invite you to reflect on the nations on whose territories you are calling in from. We will spend the rest of our time together commemorating genocides in far-off lands, and so it is fitting to begin by recognizing the ongoing cultural genocide right here, right now. The violence that has been done to our indigenous people of this land. May our work here today strengthen our resolve to engage in the work of reconciliation with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people native to this land. Andrea.
Thank you. And at this point, I would like to welcome Imam Adnan Balihodzic, Imam of the Bosnian Islamic Association, Gazi Husrev Beg, here in Toronto, and Rabbi Jordan Helfman, the Associate Rabbi at Holy Temple and an Executive Board Member of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, to offer some words and an invocation. Imam, would you unmute yourself, please, and begin?
Yes, absolutely. So, assalamu alaikum and shalom and greetings of peace to everyone who's following us and watching us this almost evening. So I just want to share, and first of all, to express my full appreciation for you organizers, you, Andy, and Ahmed especially, and all the team that was involved in making this possible tonight. I'm going to just share a few words from our ex-Grand Mufti of Bosnia, who said that Muslims, Jews, and Christians share an immense spiritual patrimony flowing from God's self-revelation. Our religious teachings and our spiritual experience demand that we overcome evil with good. We remember, but not with any desire for revenge or as an incentive to hatred. For us to remember is to pray for peace and justice and to commit ourselves to their cause. Only a world at peace with justice for all can avoid repeating the mistakes and terrible crimes of the past. This is what I want to share tonight at the beginning of this event.
Thank you, that was beautiful.
I also want to add in my thanks to everyone who came together to make this evening possible. Thank you. I know Ahmed and Andy, you stand at the head of the organizing committee, so thanking you, thanks everyone for pulling it together. Under the Polish green trees, no more at play are Sorle, Leile, Moshelach, or Shloimelach. No longer are heard the mischievous voices of children playing heroes and tricksters. Now, the Polish trees mourn. The Jewish homes there are dead. The streets trip up those that walk on stumbling stones of memory. Identities and stories there are still hiding, as the children once hid, as quiet, shivering mice. And then, 50 years later again, for far too long, the international community committed the sin of all good people, the sin of inaction, of standing idly by, of doing nothing, of silence. And so we come together with the word in Hebrew, Yizkor. God will remember, we will mourn. Yizkor, we will remember. Srebrenica is a reminder that memory cannot be passive. When we put stones on the graves of our dead, we make a pledge to carry their legacy into the world. And so tonight, as we create a marker and carve out time for remembrance, we shout, look how far humanity can fall. We fight hatred and systems of oppression, both overseas and in our own homes, as we pledge Yizkor that we will not forget.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Imam. I would also like to acknowledge your participation in putting this event together. I think we all learned a great deal from having both of you as being part of the planning committee. Ahmet, would you like to continue?
Thanks for these beautiful words, Imam Balihodzic and Rabbi Hoffman. It is indeed a very moving experience to listen to you. After 50 years, we said never again. Another genocide took place on European soil, which reminded us that it is important to remember these dark chapters of our collective history and be vigilant against all forms of hate and intolerance. Now we will have a brief video which will help us to remember what happened 25 years ago in Srebrenica. And just a word of caution, the video contains some graphic elements.
In hope, in prayer, we fight.
My apologies, I'm having a little bit of a technical difficulty here with the screen sharing. I'll be right there.
Srebrenica genocide stands as one of the worst episodes of ethnic.
Jer muslimanski narod ne može da se odbrani ako bude rat ovdje.
The Srebrenica genocide stands as one of the worst episodes of ethnic cleansing in Europe after the Second World War.
What's happening here?
Story of the mass murders and persecution of Bosnian Muslims. Srebrenica genocide stands as one of the worst episodes of ethnic cleansing in Europe after the Second World War. Over 5 days, 8,000 unarmed Bosnian Muslim men and boys were massacred by the Bosnian Serb military forces, while thousands of women were raped. But the story of the mass murders and persecution of Bosnian Muslims does not begin here. After the breakup of Yugoslavia, military conflict quickly erupted, first in Slovenia and Croatia, and finally Bosnia. And while there were losses on all fronts, Bosnian Muslims seemed to pay the highest price. Only a month after the Bosnian Declaration of Independence in March 1992, a Serbia-based paramilitary group attacked the city of Bijeljina, slaughtering between 48 and 78 non-Serb civilians in a single day. This was the beginning of what would become 4 years of killing, persecution, and rape. Soon after, other towns along the Serbian border started to share the same fate. Between May and August 1992, in the city of Prijedor, over 3,100 non-Serb civilians were massacred, the majority of them Muslims. When the massacres began in other cities on the border with Serbia, it was clear that the aim was to ethnically cleanse the region from the Muslim population. In the city of Visegrad, between April and August of the same year, another 3,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed, 70 of them locked up and burned alive in a local house. Concentration camps began to appear. A hotel near the city was used as a brothel camp, where women and girls as young as 7 were continuously raped, some for over 8 months. By the end of 1992, there were close to another 3,000 victims in the cities of Zvornik, Vlasenica, and Tuzla. The massacres that happened in the city of Foča, with 2,074 Muslim victims, paved the way to what was to eventually take place in Srebrenica in 1995. The UN safe zone of Srebrenica, where over 8,300 people were murdered, was the last city of eastern Bosnia from which the Muslim population was purged. Along with the Markale massacres in Sarajevo, they became the 2 main reasons that the international forces stepped in and began the peace process. By the end of the war, over 64,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed, half of them civilians. Around 50,000 women and girls were raped. Thousands were forced to leave their homes, the majority of whom never returned. The last population census from 2013 showed that the Muslim population in the eastern and northern part of Bosnia had decreased between 50 to 100%. The peace treaty signed in Dayton in 1995 ended the war, but also created the Republika Srpska, whose borders were drawn around the mass murders. The Srebrenica massacre was ruled as genocide by the International Court of Justice, but the other slaughters of the Muslim population in Bosnia haven't been classified the same. Many of those who committed or were directly involved in the murders and rapes of Bosnian Muslims have not yet been prosecuted, and Bosnian Muslims say there is still no justice.
And now, before moving to the discussion where we are going to reflect and remember, I would like to acknowledge some of the organizations that helped to bring this program to you tonight. This event has been put together by a committee that emerged from Holy Blossom and Imdadul Islamic Centers moving from hate to hope programming. As volunteers, we represent the following community partners: Bosnian Islamic Association Gazi Hüsrev Bek, Intercultural Dialogue Institute, Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, Canadian Anti-Hate Network, J-Space Canada, Enhancing Social Justice Education, Sisterhood of Salam and Shalom. Thanks to our partner organizations. In addition to the committee members whom you see today, I also would like to acknowledge committee members who helped to put together today's program. Ellen Simon from Enhancing Social Justice Education, Munib Nasir from Olive Tree Foundation, and Sheila Smolkin from Holy Blossom Temple. Thanks for your contributions. And now let me turn to Andrea to introduce you our panelists.
Thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Jordan, for stepping in there with the video when my internet shut down unexpectedly. So why are we here now in Canada talking about these things? Well, we've invited two really special speakers to address this, and they are the experts in this. So rather than answer the question, why here, why now? There is the obvious significance of 25 years and 75 years. There is the importance of, as Rabbi Helfman said, having active memory. Both of these genocides continue to affect Muslim and Jewish communities around the world. And we need to heal, and we can't do that if we're not talking about it. Genocide requires the rest of the world to look away. Canada failed both the Muslim people of Bosnia and the Jewish people of Germany, and we need to do better. Canadian Louise Arbour was the chief prosecutor of the UN International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda when indictments of genocide were laid and when the final arrests were made. Sorry, the first arrests, not the final arrests. She often said that the tribunal was Nuremberg's legal legacy. And so what we're going to do today is learn more about what we can do as communities and individuals and educators. And so we'd like to invite Denis Sujic and Leora Schaefer onto our screens now. And Denis is here with us today from the Institute for Research Genocide Canada, is originally from Bihać, Bosnia, and completed his master's degree in international affairs at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. He also holds a BA honors with a double major in degree in political science and sociology from the University of Ottawa. And his present research focuses on violent radicalization and political violence. Welcome, Denis. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that introduction. I'm very honored to be here at this great event. I want to thank you and all the organizers for putting this together. As you know, it's the 25th anniversary of Srebrenica genocide. The span years between the Holocaust and the Srebrenica genocide was only 50 years. And we've said in 1945, never again. But the international community has failed miserably. And we're here to honor the victims and to remember their stories, because their stories are the most important, but also remember facts that surround the incidents in Srebrenica and Bosnia and during World War II. So I would like to just start with a couple of things. I'm very happy that the video demonstrated that genocide did not just occur in Srebrenica. The ethnic cleansing campaign was along the border with Serbia, and let's not make no mistakes about it. It was a widespread campaign in Bosnia. So places like Foča, Visegrad, Prijedor were all experiencing similar, just of a lesser scale, mass murders. So 25 years we're sitting here now, and it's just the fact that bodies are still being discovered, and the mass graves, some of them have not yet been uncovered, is a fact to the degree of this genocide. And we have a responsibility to bring out truths out into open and to reveal that. And there is indeed a big correlation between the ideology that drove mass murder campaign in Bosnia and the genocide, which was driven by radical right, and that was the same ideology that people use today to justify their anti-Semitic attacks, Islamophobic attacks, to justify their xenophobia. And we have seen an open embracement of radical political discourse and it being used for violent extremism. We have seen that the most recent attack in New Zealand on the worshippers We have seen a synagogue attack in Pittsburgh. And we have to come to realize that these aren't just individuals that woke up one day and decided to resort to violent extremism, to express their grievances. These are deeply rooted ideologies. And for instance, the New Zealand shooter, he was very well aware of the happenings in the history of Europe and the myths and conspiracy theories. His guns had written all over them dates of famous battles between the Ottomans and Europeans. And these myths, such as the clash of civilization, which Dr. Samuel Huntington introduced, and the idea that somehow the minorities in the West are the invaders, are very dangerous. And we have to be able to recognize them and educate ourselves to be able to fight the extremist rhetoric and not make the same mistakes that were made in the past. So moving from hate to hope, I think there's many ways to approach it. I do think there are certain elements that we have to identify that are essential. Number one being lessons learned. What have we really learned from the Holocaust, from Srebrenica genocide? We have to bring those responsible to justice. Many people don't know, but there are individuals that have been involved in Srebrenica genocide walking freely across Bosnia. We have to educate. We have to be able to recognize extremist rhetoric when it does appear in conflicts, when it does appear on surface. We have to fight the denial of genocide. So right now we see an evolution of genocide denial that's on a global level. We have a few days ago, Prime Minister of Serbia saying that genocide, what we call genocide, what was genocide, was a misunderstanding. And this is a rhetoric that's present along the Serb nationalists in Bosnia and in Serbia. And this is what we need to fight. And unfortunately, culture of denial of genocide has become an important instrument. And we see the politicians spending money in research on alternative facts that are proving that there was not a genocide. And we have to hold these people responsible. So in other words, denying genocide has become politically profitable. It's the glorification of war criminals and the deniers. We have in Republika Srpska now a statue being built for Peter Handke, who's a genocide denier, and so on. So the other point is definitely we have to hold our governments responsible, and that goes on all levels, intellectual, practical, whether that is contacting your local MP or any other involvement. We do have to make sure that these mistakes don't happen again. We have to join efforts in fighting against all other forms of racism, especially in Canada, against the Indigenous racism. We have to ensure that we don't choose the type of racism we fight against. We fight against all, whether that is against the Jewish communities, the Muslim communities, the Indigenous communities, whether that is with the Black Lives Matter movement. So only by joining efforts and fighting this type of extremist rhetoric, our voice is going to be heard, and our voice is the loudest. And bridges are built by bringing truths out into open, and that is indeed the primary step towards any kind of reconciliation and conflict resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad that you brought up the way that all of these past issues are related to what we're seeing in our lives today, right here, right now in Canada. Thank you for that. Leora is the executive director of Facing History Facing History and Ourselves Canada. This is an organization that engages teachers and students in the study of history through an approach that encourages critical reflection and active citizenship. Leora has worked in the field of Holocaust and genocide education for over 20 years. As the executive director of Facing History, she oversees and develops professional development opportunities for educators, curricular initiatives for schools, and educational events for the greater community. She facilitates professional development for educators on teaching practice and pedagogy. And Leora works with all levels of education, from ministries of education to school boards and all the way across Canada. So Leora, would you follow up on what Dennis was saying and talk to us a little bit about why it's important that we learn and commemorate these genocides?
Absolutely. So I want to begin by echoing Dennis's gratitude for being part and invited to be part of this panel and this program and the commemoration this evening. It's such an important moment and such a meaningful way for me to engage. So I want to thank the committee for putting forth this incredible program. And the question you raise is a really important one. And of course, we think about this as it connects to youth and how we want to engage youth in thinking about history. And so as we think about genocide in particular, what the quote that is so often brought forth is the George Santayana quote, he was an author, a poet, a philosopher. And, the quote that I'm sure many, if not all of us know is that, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And, that's the simple answer, right? We want students to learn, we want young people to engage in the learning of history in order to prevent future atrocities. But it's not so simple, right? And if we can all think about, I can't see everybody who's a part of this sort of virtual classroom, this virtual learning space, but I imagine we are coming from many different ages and different generations. But if we think about how we learned about history, I'm sure your education was not too dissimilar from my own, where history is taught in a way that it's a lot of memorizations of dates and places and people. You learn, it's in a chapter in a book, it has a beginning and an end, and you move forward very quickly after an exam or a test that is mostly multiple choice questions. Everything's tied up neatly with a bow, and you move on to the next moment. And I would say that, if you think about this quote, it's not the learning that's an important point. I mean, one could say that is learning, that's a classroom, and yet it's the learning from, right? In that quote, it's the learning from. And so not every way we learn about history is the same. And what we want from young people, what we are here as Facing History to do is to support young people to really wrestle with that history, to not simply learn the names and the places and the dates and move on. Those are important, but we can't move on. In fact, what we need to make sure that we're doing is really deeply, deeply thinking about that. And at Facing History, we've been doing this work for over 40 years. Here in Canada, we've been here for little over 10 years. And we've had incredible educators in Ontario working with Facing History since the early 80s, actually. And so we began as an organization looking at the Holocaust. And yet, if we think about 75 years since liberation, 25 years since the genocide in Srebrenica, for the students in our classrooms, that might as well be the Middle Ages. For me, I don't remember liberation. I do remember the genocide in Srebrenica. And our students don't. And so 25 years ago is a lifetime. And those images that they see, if we bring them to our students, don't have enough meaning in the same way that it might for those of us who remember reading and seeing that in the news. And so while Facing History began thinking about the Holocaust, right, we were thinking about how to bring that learning into a meaningful place. And since then, we've developed other content related to the learning of genocide here in Canada. We developed a really important resource for us as an organization looking at the residential schools. And so maybe there'll be a time later in the conversation to talk about how we hold genocides together as we think about both the common shared experiences of those who were victims and survivors, but also the particulars. And so there's an important conversation to be had about how we have those conversations and how we hold, and we each in their particulars, we learn about what happened in each, and yet we can find these places where we can learn from holding two moments together. And so the question is, how do we bring these moments meaningfully into students' lives? And for us, it's about engaging in the intellectual, right? We need students to be historians. We need them to learn about the history. We also need to engage the heart. They need to be hearing, Dennis talked about the survivor voice. You know, that is so important that we listen to the survivors, that we learn from, and we connect through our hearts. And we also need to be thinking critically around these big questions that we learn from genocides, the questions, the moral, the ethics. We need to be thinking in that way. And so when we think with teachers and students, we want we talk about this triangle, the head, the heart, I don't know, maybe the guts, right, where those ethical reflections sit. And we want, ultimately, when learning in that way happens, students are motivated to do something. That's learning that moves them. And all along, we're asking students to think about themselves. So who are they? And so if we're going to make connections between something that happened so many years ago for these students in a different world, in a different time, in a different place, they also need to be connecting to who they are and how they live in the world, and thinking about the roles that people play. You know, the roles, what does it mean to actually be an upstander and to take a stand? And we can look at history to find models of those upstanders in these moments, in these histories that we examine. And, you know, as we think about the study of any history, we know, and Dennis brought this up, you brought this up, denial. You know, these moments, unlike the way I learned in my classroom when I was a student, we know that it doesn't end. You know, World War II doesn't end and then you move on to the Cold War. You don't end, you know, these moments. Srebrenica didn't end on that last day, you know, the lasting legacies. And so commemoration and justice becomes a really important question for us to think about and to talk with students about. And I guess, you know, we have more time now for conversation and questions, but I want to say that, you know, the work of Facing History, I think about it as in the work of building allies. So what we find when you have a study, when you have a learning that really connects with students and they're making these personal connections and they're engaged in a way that makes them want to stand up and do something and realize when, you know, their moral compass is being pushed up against, like, something that we need to do something about this. What we find in Facing History through evaluation is that students are more likely to recognize these moments, recognize anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry. They're also more likely than their non-Facing History peers to actually then do something about it and stand up. And to me, that equation is about creating allies. Everybody needs someone else to have their back. It's exhausting to only fight for yourself. And I think, you know, that's where I'll end this part, my remarks, in thinking that, you know, that is the beauty of this coming together for me. This is really about allies, it's about partnerships. And that, I think, really happens when not only deep learning happens, but also engaging with people and stories in a meaningful way. And so, you know, it's really an honor to be part of this evening that I think so deeply reflects that kind of learning and those kinds of meaningful, deep engagements that are not superficial, but that actually allow us to build true relationships with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Leora. I'm really glad you ended on that note, because that is exactly the point of this panel. It is to create allyship between all of our communities, all of the people present here today. When we were putting this together, those of us who work on this are of the belief that if we actually want never again to be a reality, we have to work together to make it happen, because we can't do it alone. And because, as you both know, being people who work on this kind of thing, hate for one group of people very rarely ends at hate for one group of people. It usually leaks out and becomes hate for many different groups of people. So in order to work together, to actually make progress. So one of the things that we wanted to ask you about is, what is the legacy of these events for our communities, for our youth? What do they do with it moving forward? And before you answer me, I want to take a moment to remind all of our lovely participants that you do have access to the Q&A box, where you can ask anything you like, and you can also ask through the chat box and on the Facebook group. Thank you.
So I guess I'll go first since I spoke first. I think that's a great question, and it's a very complex question because it's essentially asking, what do people do? What do youth that are being brought up do? What do we do? And I think there's many things. I think remembering is one, and as Imam Adnan said earlier, not to remember for revenge, but to remember to honor the victims, to not repeat the same mistakes, because those that forget, they're doomed to repeat them. And we've seen it all over the history. And 50 years, historically speaking, is not a long time. And so definitely to remember, to get involved, to challenge political discourses on some of these issues. In terms of genocide in Bosnia and the Holocaust, there was clear intelligence on the intent, at least of occupying Srebrenica. So challenging your political leaders, getting involved in political activism, remembering, honoring the victims, learning more. We also need to do a lot more to invest in our education on these issues. I mean, I finished my high school in Ottawa, and I don't remember taking a class that we spoke about Srebrenica genocide somewhere, which is sort of shocking to me. So I think that's a big step, because if we're not educating, it's hard to move forward toward, even remembering, toward even understanding the stories of victims. So definitely those are some of the things that I would point out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have much to add. That was beautiful. I think that it really is about finding ways to empower young people to recognize that, this just doesn't happen in the past. Facing history, we have a great sort of tagline that I think is so important. I feel like I should wear it on shirts all the time. People make choices, choices make history. And so I think, particularly young people feel that, this is just happening. Like, horrible things are happening. How am I supposed to get engaged? I can't even vote. I can't do, what are the tools that I actually have to create change? And, even as an adult, you open the newspaper and it's so easy to just feel like I'm going to hide under the bed. I'm not getting out today. I'm just going to stay in. There's nothing I can do. There's just too many horrible things. And yet we don't have that option. And so to help the young people really understand that history is not inevitable, that we're not just on this path going from on this fast moving train that's taking us along, that actually we're making active choices. And, to Dennis's point around, getting engaged, writing the letters, being involved politically, even reading the newspaper, right, as a first step, that these are things that we can do. And the earlier we recognize these moments, the more agency we have to actually do something. That we see through the lessons of the Holocaust and Srebrenica and these other moments, that there are moments where protest and intervention and letter writing can make a difference. And then we also see that there's a point where we then we get into, Larry Langer coined the term related to the Holocaust, but it fits in so many different moments and histories, choiceless choice, right? Once we're in a point where we're not actually facing choices, then we really are more helpless in these scenarios. So the earlier we can recognize, and the more we can help young people understand democracy, what are democratic values? What are the tenets that we need to uphold? Why is it important that we have a judiciary system? Right? These are a free press. And the moment that we see, even as young people, especially as young people, that these rights and freedoms are being encroached upon, whether they're in our own backyard or somewhere else, we have a responsibility to engage. And so I think that's hard. That's a big lesson for young people. But again, it's the way that it's brought into the classroom, and the human stories that can motivate us. That it actually matters. These things matter. Is really, I think, if that's not part of education, then I think we've really missed the boat.
Dennis, did you want to respond to what Leora was saying?
Yeah, I would just like to add, I guess, an additional point of concern almost. Like one of the problems with Srebrenica genocide and education is that in Bosnia, in Serbia, in the Balkans, we don't have education that is giving people and the kids capacity to weed out extremist rhetoric, right from wrong, and to look at the history objectively. So I think that's one of the challenge. And that goes to my next point, is that the Western educational institutions have a duty to teach and to sort of do work in opening out the truths and surrounding the genocide. So thank you very much, Leora, for speaking on that issue as well.
That actually ties into a question that we've received from one of our viewers who was asking how we can help prevent, and I know it's beyond any of us to actually tell a social media platform what to do, but how do we mitigate the amount of space and time that is given to genocide denial on social media?
Dennis, do you want to take a stab at this first?
Yeah, that is a great question, and sort of ties into radicalization issue as well, right? Because internet is the most important, the most common tool of radicalization. And so genocide deniers use internet, and it's much easier to use internet to spread any kind of extremist rhetoric or any kind of controversial views that you have online. So I think that goes to it's a very complex question, because a lot of social media platforms are privatized, and you reach into the problem of free speech and who draws the borders, like who draws the line of free speech. We believe that genocide denial is horrible, because it doesn't honor the victims, it doesn't dignify those who have suffered. And so I think having an effect on social media platforms in the sense of whether that is involvement through political means or any other, but sort of to get some sort of word out there that this is wrong, this is extremist rhetoric, this material needs not to be here. It's a very tough task ahead of us, but I think we can do work in this regard.
Yeah. You know, I'll answer from the other side of things, that it is, you're right, Dennis. It's a difficult task to control. Well, it's social media, free speech. These are not easy, but what we can do is we can help students, but really the general public. We all need these skills. It's media literacy. How do you know your sources? Where are you getting your information? How are you fact checking your information? And so it goes to genocide denial. It goes to just skills that young people need today. It is too easy to be misled by very slick campaigns that look to be true, that look to be factual. And so helping young people gain those tools, that's really something that I know, you know, facing as an organization we're thinking about, but also our teachers are really working with their students to help navigate sources and where they're gaining their sources.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Leora. And I think one of the things we can also do is we can have a voice as well that's stronger of the voice of the deniers. Yeah. And I think that's one of the most important, and that's one of the most important aspects. And if we don't have a voice, if we don't speak about these issues, then guess what? We're not going to be heard. And yeah.
So bottom line, what I'm hearing is media literacy and talk louder than them. Yeah. That's actually a question that's very near and dear to my heart, because it is one of the bigger issues that I face as an educator, mostly online. So I think another really important thing is for teachers to become educated.
Yeah.
Because if the teachers themselves don't know what their students are hearing or learning, or what the dangers are of, whether it's denial or another form of radicalization, then we can't support our students if we don't understand what it is they're facing.
Yeah, the problem with denial in the Balkans is that it's being enforced and introduced by legitimate political parties and actors that are using genocide denial for their electoral campaigns. I mean, you have that both in Republika Srpska, both the leading party and the opposition, they will not win the elections if they don't deny genocide. So besides having a greater voice online against genocide deniers, we also need to get political involvement in the West and to pressure whatever means we have available with pressure those actors that are speaking against these issues.
I was very pleased to see in the programming put out by the Srebrenica Memorial Center a conference on denial and triumphalism. I think one of the points that you bring up is one that I heard over and over in those talks, is that the truth of our history is now directly related to the survival of our democratic systems. And that we can't actually separate the two anymore. I wonder if you can expand a little bit on that.
I'm not an expert in democracy or...
Neither am I.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with Bosnian genocide and Srebrenica genocide was that the result of the genocide was a reward for the perpetrators. Yeah. Which was the granting of Republika Srpska entity. I mean, we have genocide being rewarded here with the Dayton Agreement, of course. So that's, if we're going to work as West to enforce democratic values and to enforce some sort of systems that we believe in, we have to think thoroughly about what we're doing. But speaking of Bosnian democracy, and it's such a complex topic that it requires its own panel. We have 5 levels of government. We have yeah, I'm not going to get into it, but I'm not sure if I've answered your question. It's a complex one, but I think we have a duty. Like the West has a duty when we're mediating these conflicts, when we're trying to make a difference, to do so in a democratic way and in a just way.
Nicely said. Nicely said. Thank you for that. So going back to education, I remember actually asking this as a student, and the question here is, the main question for students to complicate would be, why did these genocides occur? And I know, like I said, I remember asking that question, and goodness knows I've spent the last 30 years trying to answer it with no success. So how do you respond to students? And obviously it's going to be different for different ages, but just as a...
So, okay. So there's, I think that, let me say 2 things about this question, because, you know, these kinds of questions are precisely, and I think, Angie, you spoke about teacher training and how prepared teachers are. So these are the very questions that frighten teachers to our soul, right? They're the questions that make us want to just put on a PowerPoint and plow through content or watch a movie And that's what happens. And actually, that's why, facing history in ourselves, why we put so much effort, why we exist is for professional development, to support teachers so that they feel that when they go into the classroom, that they can be there when students ask these questions and sit in the messiness of them. And then, we don't have to have answers for everything as educators. And some of the best questions, to your point, Andy, don't actually have answers. They're complex. That's why, when I reflected on those multiple choice questions, you can't have a how did this genocide happen? A, B, it doesn't work. And so actually being open to the complexity of the question and the pieces that go into a response. And so some of the pieces that we focus on and help teachers bring to the table is a look at human behavior. What makes a person? What's the psychology that we know behind obedience? What's the psychology behind group behavior and standing idly by, right? Versus what's the psychology that we know around what helps people stand up and take a stand. You also have to know, where we start the history is really important. So, when the Holocaust is a perfect example, kids think that the Holocaust started in the death camps. And yet actually thinking about what needs to be learned, it's the problem with textbooks also, those textbooks that I referenced, right? So where do you start the learning? You have to understand the history of the Holocaust. You have to understand, when we're talking about democracy, you have to learn about Weimar. And, there are these same questions that we encounter when we look at, and we saw this in the film, that short piece, right? We're not starting in the establishment of concentration camps. We're starting back. We have to understand what took place in that region. And so I'm not giving an answer because these are the questions that don't have answers, but they are the very questions that engage students. And so we have a responsibility to sit with students to think about these questions, even though as educators or as adults or as citizens, we don't have answers. There's no this is the answer to that question, but it takes time, and it also takes professional development so that as a teacher, I feel like I can breathe as an educator. I don't have to have every answer. And actually there's communal learning that we bring into this learning. We can come together to bring our perspectives to understand, what might go into a response, maybe not an answer.
Dennis, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think the question was, how do we teach about what started genocide, or something along those lines? I'm not an educator myself, but I think it's a very sensitive topic. I think it also depends on the age group and whom you're teaching it to. But I think it's important to teach. I think the reason for that is because sooner or later, these students are going to go into political offices. Mm. They're going to go into international organizations that they will be making a difference. And that's something to consider. The main point being is that we have to teach them to look at the history objectively and look at the facts. And the fact is that the Holocaust happened. It was a genocide. Srebrenica happened. It was a genocide. And those were proven facts by internationally recognized courts. Yeah. And I think that's the starter.
Thank you for that. I could not agree more with what you're both saying. I think it's essential to teach the young people because they are one day going to be us. And, all of us here learned about it somehow. And for most of us, it was not in our classrooms. It was not in our public schools. It was out of our own interest or something along those lines. So we do have to start wrapping it up because it is 8:30. And I am going to come back to what brought us together in the first place, this Moving from Hate to Hope series of programs, which is how to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as allies. So how to come together as Muslims, as Jews, as people of all faiths, as people of no faith or questioning faith. How do we come together to fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia?
Leora, did you want to tackle this one first?
Very quickly. I mean, I think we
question.
Right. I mean, this is great. You know, I think it's just more of this. I mean, I think more real engagement between groups of people. Just as Genocide said, louder voices. We have to be louder. We have to be more informed. We have to be there for one another. And I think the more we can have authentic, meaningful engagements, the better off we'll be. And let's remember the diversity of our classrooms. Students are in these spaces together. And so the more we can build spaces for students where real relationships and learning and sharing can happen, where students feel safe to share, the better off we will all be. So, I mean, I would say more of this in all sectors of society.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think joining efforts with the commonalities we have as the communities in Canada and the Western world in general, you know, sharing a very painful history, unfortunately, can unite us together to fight and educate one another and engage. So yeah, I think I don't have much to add to what Leora has said on the question, but I think that's the key: engagement, education, involvement. Yeah.
Yeah, my personal mantra is that it's really hard to hate somebody for their identity once they become your friend.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we've tried to do here. I'm getting a message here. I'm sorry, Ahmed, would you like to? I'm sorry. So when we're talking about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and about these two genocides, you know, one of the things that often happens when we work in intersectional spaces like this is that we tend to fall into what is often called the oppression Olympics, right? And I hope that one of the things that we managed to do in this program was not to create an equivalency between the Holocaust and Srebrenica, because they're not the same. No two genocides will ever be the same. But could you talk just a tiny bit about how, why it's important to study more than one genocide?
So yes, I mean, this is a whole other panel, a whole other conversation that I would love to get, you know, maybe for another time. But I think that, again, I'll go back to relationships. I think that when we learn different histories, when we can experience and see the lived experiences of others, there's great learning there. And I will, you know, to your point of sort of this comparative nature that we sometimes get into, the way to avoid that is to understand that I think, you know, I said this in the opening remarks, that each history has its particulars. We need to hold those in some way sacred, right? And we need to take up responsibility to learn them and understand each moment. And yet there's also shared experiences. And when you read and listen to survivors, you see that. You hear those shared experiences, and there's something very, very motivating and mobilizing around when you hear these stories together, that you're motivated because of the emotional connection, because you see those relationships, because you see those connections, to do something, to prevent. I mean, let's stop having more survivors have these shared experiences, right? Let's try to work towards ending that. But I think that it's that balance of holding each in its own history and its own place as you then connect, and really being careful around facile comparisons. The more we can avoid saying that this is just like this or this is not, you know, then that actually will help keep those moments in their uniqueness, and will prevent us from feeling like we lose something. We actually don't lose anything when we have these sorts of moments. We actually only gain. And I think there is this fear that what I might feel is so personally important and meaningful will somehow become less important if I give space for someone else. And yet it is actually the opposite that happens. And so if we can hold all of that together, I think that there's great learning in these moments, and modeling programs just like this, modeling in classrooms these kinds of learning, so that we can have those moments that actually move this forward. So I think that's how I think a good place to end, and hand over to Dennis if you have anything else.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, when it comes to genocide learning, as you said, Andy, no genocide is the same, but there are patterns. There's 10 stages of genocide that we can recognize. And I don't want to get into other issues and other genocides, but there are instances where we have to be able to understand what's going on. Because if we don't, same thing is going to happen like in Srebrenica, same thing is going to happen like in Holocaust. And by coming together, we're building the bridges, and that's only going to make us stronger and our voice louder. And I think that's the most important thing. And just another point is that we have to realize that by learning about genocide, we have to understand that it can happen anywhere. Srebrenica was not in the Middle East. It was not in Iraq. It was not in Syria. It was in the middle of Europe.
Yeah.
And this is something that we have to be very cognizant of.
I think that's a perfect ending to this incredibly insightful and exhilarating conversation that has left my mind spinning with so many more ideas and thoughts. Thank you both so very much for being with us. To our participants whose questions did not get answered, we will be sending out a survey after the event, and hopefully we can come back and talk more. That would be really awesome. Thank you very much, Leora and Dennis, for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And now, for closing remarks, I would like to invite Imam Adnan Balihodrich and Rabbi Hoffman and Karen Mack. And we would like to turn the microphone over to Karen first, the president of JSpace, who is an active member of almost all the groups who have worked together as community partners to bring you this webinar. For an introduction, Dr. Mock is the past executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and of the League of Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, where she led the Holocaust and Hope Educators Study Tour for 12 years. Karen has received the Order of Canada for her ongoing anti-racism, intercultural and human rights work, and in particular for bringing Muslims and Jews together in common cause, as we have done today. Karen?
Thank you very much. Before my actual closing remarks on this amazing evening, we wanted to invite the Imam back and the Rabbi together, where the Imam will lead us in a closing prayer, and then I will take it from there. Imam?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and the honor actually to conclude this really excellent event that we've had with this prayer. And I would really like to have Rabbi Jordan with me present, at least at the screen, to say this prayer together. It's a short prayer that very significant one that we, all these years after Srebrenica happened, actually this Bosnian genocide happened, say and especially at the occasion of each of those funerals, mass funerals that we have for the victims, newly discovered actually remains of their bodies, like on these days on July 11 actually, each year. And we say this prayer, and part of this prayer, actually concluding part, is engraved in that monument, central monument in the cemetery of those thousands of victims in Srebrenica itself. So I invite you now, all of you, to pray to our God, to our Lord, this prayer together. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, God, the most gracious, the most merciful. O our Lord, do not let success deceive us, or defeat drive us to despair. Keep reminding us that failure is temptation that precedes success. Our Lord, teach us that tolerance is the highest degree of strength, and the desire for revenge the first sign of weakness. Our Lord, if you deprive us of our property, leave us hope. If you grant us no success, grant us the willpower to overcome the defeat. And if you take away the blessing of health, grant us the blessing of faith. Our Lord, when we sin against people, grant us the power to ask for forgiveness. And when people harm us, grant us the power to forgive. Our Lord, if we forget you, please, you do not forget us. And please allow me just to conclude with that, what is engraved in the monument in Bosnian language too. Molimo te, o Allahu, da tuga bude nada, da osveta bude pravda, da majčina suza bude molitva, dova, da se više nikada i nikome ne ponovi Srebrenica. We pray to you, O Almighty God, may grief become hope, may revenge become justice, may mothers' tears become prayers, that Srebrenica never happens again to no one and nowhere. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Amin.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all of you on the panel. Ahmed and Andy, for your leadership and hard work on the planning committee, and for your outstanding co-facilitation of today's webinar. And thank you also to our excellent guest speakers, Dennis and Leora, for your leadership in bringing such important learning opportunities to communities and schools across Canada. Thank you again to the Hate to Hope planning team. It is a perfect example of Margaret Mead's famous expression, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I want to give a special shout out to Common Green for being the catalyst for creating the Hate to Hope program to increase the joint activism of Jews and Muslims by raising awareness and by exposing and standing up against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together. In the wake of the murders in the Quebec Mosque and Pittsburgh Synagogue, over 400 people gathered at Holy Blossom Temple last year for the launch of the Hate to Hope initiative to build on their relations from Circles of Peace and to do follow-up seminars at Holy Blossom Temple and the Imdadul Islamic Center to develop practical skills. Thank you, Rabbi Jordan, and also Imam Adnan and your colleagues for your ongoing leadership in our congregations bringing Jews and Muslims together in common cause. Today's webinar was the work of volunteers who let us know that they wanted to keep the Hate to Hope program going. We welcome others to join us from all faith backgrounds, and as Andy said, we shall be sending a brief follow-up survey in a few days to all of you, especially those whose questions weren't answered. This is an opportunity to indicate your interest. Several of you put in questions that said, please forgive me for not asking it in the form of a question, but I'm really engaged, and I'd like to be more engaged. Be sure to let us know what further topics you would like to explore and how you can become actively involved in our planning or in any of our community partner organizations that focus on specific aspects of this important work. We had wanted to end our seminar today with a cultural program. It was a little tricky during COVID to get a youth choir together, Muslims and Jews singing together, but God willing, someday we'll do that. But instead, as we vow to continue to remember and learn together, I want to close by quoting from Miller Williams' poem that captures our mission and our goals so well. The poem is called Of History and Hope. In ceremonies and silence, we say the words, telling the story, singing the old songs. We like the places they take us. Mostly we do. The great and all the anonymous dead are there. We know the sound of all the sounds we brought. The rich taste of it is on our tongues. But where are we going to be? And why? And who? The disenfranchised dead want to know. We mean to be the people we meant to be, to keep on going where we were meant to go. But how do we fashion the future? Who can say how, except in the minds of those who will call it now? The children. The children. And how does our garden grow? With waving hands, oh, rarely in a row, and flowering faces, and brambles that we can no longer allow. Who were many people coming together, cannot become one people falling apart. Who dreamed for every child an even chance, cannot let luck alone turn doorknobs or not. Whose law was never so much of the hand as the head, cannot let chaos make its way to the heart. Who have seen learning struggle from teacher to child, cannot let ignorance spread itself like rot. We know what we have done and what we have said, and how we have grown degree by slow degree, believing ourselves toward all we have tried to become, just and compassionate, equal, able, and free. All this in the hands of children, eyes already set on a land we can never visit. It isn't there yet. But looking through their eyes, we can see what our long gift to them may come to be. If we can truly remember, they will not forget. Thank you again for joining us this evening to remember and to learn together. We look forward to your joining us again in the fall when the Enhancing Social Justice Education Group will present a session during Holocaust Education Week as we continue to bring learning resources to educators and communities so the next generations will recognize the signs of totalitarian thinking against any marginalized or racialized group. If we truly want the term never again to mean something, remember that in order to move from hate to hope. We are stronger if we are together. Thank you.
In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here.
We won't be divided, rise with spirit to guide us, rise.